The Holocaust is one of the most well-documented genocides in history. There's an enormous collection of documentary and witness evidence from both victims and perpetrators proving the mass murder of Europe's Jews by Nazi Germany, and of course a huge verifiable drop in the world's Jewish population after the Second World War. But how is the death toll actually calculated? In this video, we'll break that topic down to show exactly how historians arrive at the figure of 6 million Jews. Before we begin, it's important to talk about the fact that there's sadly a small but vocal minority of people who don't believe that these atrocities took place. Holocaust deniers often try to cast doubt on the figure of 6 million by questioning the mathematical plausibility of this number. 6 million people over roughly 6 years is around 100 people an hour, they say. How is that even possible? Well, sadly, very easily. You see, as an appeal to incredulity, these back-of-a-cigarette packet calculations are just an irrelevant logical fallacy. Instead of shedding light on historical fact, they do the opposite and demonstrate a serious lack of understanding or interest in the real magnitude of the Holocaust. For example, on the 29th and 30th of September 1941, at a ravine called Babin Yar or Babi Yar in Kiev, Ukraine, SS and Nazi police units shot 33,771 Jews. That's just over 700 people an hour, in just 2 days, in only one location, one city, out of all of Europe during nearly 6 years of war. So, claiming that the Holocaust didn't happen because killing 100 people an hour would have been impossible doesn't make any sense at all, because the actual reality of the Holocaust was far worse. There's another deeply misleading claim by Holocaust deniers that the Red Cross recorded an overall death toll of 271,000. This claim is based on the misrepresentation and in some cases even the forgery of documents by a different organisation. This document is not from the Red Cross, and the figures given in it are not final death tolls. They're actually the amounts of death certificates issued by a German government agency called the Sonderstandesamt, or Special Registry Office, for a small number of Jewish and non-Jewish concentration camp victims. These death certificates were issued on the basis of wartime paperwork that documented the deaths of these people by name, and the reason why the number seems surprisingly small is that this paperwork is very rarely available, either because it was lost or destroyed, or usually because it never existed in the first place. For example, the overwhelming majority of those selected to die in gas chambers was sent to them immediately after they arrived at the camps, without ever being registered into them on an individually identifiable basis. As will be seen in this video, this figure is very, very easily proven to be wrong. This is another letter from the Sonderstandesamt reporting the amounts of death certificates issued that's sometimes misrepresented as a list of final camp death tolls. It's especially stupid to use this letter in this way because it literally says at the bottom in German that the figures given in this letter cannot be used to draw any conclusions about overall camp death tolls whatsoever. This is the perfect example of why there's nothing academic or intelligent or honest about Holocaust denial or Holocaust revisionism as it sometimes likes to call itself. It doesn't care about good scholarship. Its goal is lying about World War II in order to absolve a certain Chancellor of Germany of his crimes. Incidentally, the Red Cross itself got so tired of people lying about the Special Registry Office data in its name, they've repeatedly stated in letters like this that they do not collect Holocaust death toll statistics and never have done, never would have been able to even if they'd wanted to, and that people are dishonestly crediting their organisation with this data in order to give it credibility it doesn't deserve. Finally, there's another absurd Holocaust denial claim that Europe's Jewish population stayed the same or even grew during the war. This claim is of course absolute nonsense, and it has its origins in the misrepresentation of the data in World Almanac encyclopedias. The 1933 edition reported that there were 15.3 million Jews in the world at the time. The 1948 edition, 15 years later, reported that there were 15.7 million. So how did the Jewish population grow during the Second World War? The answer, of course, is that it didn't. The 1946, 47 and 48 editions of the World Almanac make it explicitly clear that they're using pre-war population figures, and it's not until the 1949 edition that post-war population figures are finally used, and the massive reduction in the world's Jewish population is finally made clear. But obviously, Holocaust deniers have no interest at all in talking about the 1949 edition and confronting the reality of what happened, preferring instead to misrepresent previous editions of the encyclopedia. And this is another perfect example of why Holocaust denial has absolutely nothing to do with the accurate and honest study of history. Its goal is to make Nazism a palatable political solution by whitewashing it of its war crimes. Anyway, now that we've broken down the fake death tolls, let's take a look at how the death toll is actually calculated and how historians arrive at the figure of 6 million. We've briefly touched on the massacre at Babin Yar, and in doing so, we've already mentioned a major factor: mass shootings. Around 2 million Jews, roughly a third of the Holocaust death toll, were shot by the Einsatzgruppen firing squads and other organisations such as Germany's allies and collaborators and the Ordnungspolizei, Nazi Germany's uniformed police service. The Einsatzgruppen operated in the wake of the conventional German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, as they moved east into Poland and the Soviet Union. Initially, their main task was to shoot Polish intellectuals and members of the clergy, but this swiftly progressed to partisans, Jews, Romani people, and Soviet political commissars. The Einsatzgruppen kept tremendously detailed records of their activities in the USSR, and these records actually survived the war. 4 Einsatzgruppen, or deployment groups, A, B, C, and D, were initially established in preparation for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And here's the map, which accompanied a report by the leader of Einsatzgruppe A, Dr. Franz Stahlecker, indicating how many Jews his unit had killed in the Baltic region up to the 31st of January 1942. For example, in Lithuania, 136,421 Jews have been shot, and Estonia is labelled as Judenfrei, Jew-free. For the Nazis, these shooting operations weren't without operational difficulties. They were inefficient, with many victims not dying quickly enough, and they were psychologically damaging for many of the men participating in them, even though only the most ardent Nazis were selected to join the Einsatzgruppen. After attending a mass shooting in August 1941 in Minsk, Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, ordered gassing to be available for the Einsatzgruppen, and gas vans were made available to all 4 Einsatzgruppen units. Victims were ordered into the van's gas-tight loading compartment, and the engine exhaust fumes were channeled inside. Gassing was already a well-established means of murder by the Nazi state. Gas vans were originally used in Operation T4, the Nazi plan to kill Germany's mentally ill and disabled, and subsequently at the Chelmno death camp, where at least 152,000 Jews were killed. However, the SS would ultimately move away from these vans in favour of fixed gas chambers, and in October 1941, Himmler ordered the construction of Belzec, the very first Operation Reinhardt death camp. Operation Reinhardt was the code name for the Nazi operation to exterminate all Polish Jews in the general government, a zone of Poland occupied by Nazi Germany. Belzec was soon followed by Sobibor and Treblinka, and these camps all followed the same design. Situated in heavily wooded areas, their entrances were disguised as fake railway stations, and victims entered the gas chambers under the pretense that they would be showered and disinfected before continuing their journey for eventual resettlement. The gas chambers were connected to the engines of captured Soviet tanks, whose deadly exhaust fumes were pumped inside. Bodies were initially thrown into mass graves before eventually being exhumed and burned in open-air cremation pyres to try to hide the evidence of genocide. 1942 was by far the deadliest phase of the Holocaust. Here's another piece of evidence pointing to the extraordinary scale of the atrocity, as noted by the historian Christopher Browning in the report he produced in defence of Deborah Lipstadt at the libel trial David Irving brought against her. It's an entry in the war diary of the Oberquartiermeister, or senior quartermaster of the military commander in Poland, dated 24th October 1942. The original German is as follows. Oberkommando Ostrov meldet, dass die Juden in Treblinka nicht ausreichend beerdigt seien und infolgedessen ein unerträglicher Kadavergeruch die Luft verpestet. Ostrov High Command reports that the Jews in Treblinka are not adequately buried, and as a result, an unbearable smell of cadavers pollutes the air. What's shocking about this is that Ostrov is 20 kilometres away from Treblinka, nearly 12.5 miles. On the 11th of January 1943, British military decoders intercepted a telegram sent by SS Hauptsturmführer or Captain Hermann Höfler to SS Lieutenant Colonels Adolf Eichmann and Franz Heim. The telegram is so significant because it details precisely how many people were sent to the Operation Reinhardt camps up to and including the 31st of December 1942. 24,733 to Lublin or Majdanek, 434,508 to Belzec, 101,370 to Sobibor, and 713,555 to Treblinka, giving a total of 1,274,166. This exact number appears in a report by SS Chief Statistician and SS Sturmbannführer or Major Richard Korher, a copy of which was provided to Hitler himself, and its purpose was to document how Europe's Jewish population had changed since the Nazis came to power. Of the approximately 10 million Jews in Europe, Koher concludes that up to the end of 1942, half of Europe's Jewish population has been lost, and only a quarter of that reduction was due to emigration. So what happened to the other roughly 2.5 million European Jews who ceased to be a part of Europe's Jewish population without leaving the continent? Koher doesn't spell it out, of course, but the only possible conclusion is that they are no longer alive. Operation Reinhardt came to an end in November 1943, and the Nazis destroyed Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka to hide evidence of their crimes. Unlike these camps, which were built as death camps from the outset, Majdanek wasn't initially understood to have been involved in Operation Reinhardt because it began as a concentration and forced labour camp, with gas chambers and crematoria being added later. However, the Höfler telegram proves that it still played some role in the operation. In total, just under 1.7 million Jews were murdered in Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka, at least 152,000 in Chelmno, at least 167,000 in Sobibor, at least 925,000 in Treblinka, and approximately 435,000 in Belzec. Adding this figure to the approximately 2 million killed in mass shootings brings us to a death toll so far of 3.7 million Jews. This is obviously well over the halfway point of 6 million. And we haven't even yet mentioned the biggest and most destructive camp complex, Auschwitz. Auschwitz began as a concentration camp, but was chosen to become a major extermination centre due to its location in Central Europe near a major railway hub. By mid-1943, 4 large crematoria and gas chamber buildings were operational at the Birkenau subcamp, and a letter by the chief of construction at Auschwitz to the head of SS construction in Berlin reported that over 4,000 corpses could be burned every single day. However, when the transports reached their highest levels with the deportation of 437,000 Hungarian Jews during the spring and summer of 1944, the crematoria simply couldn't keep up, and bodies were burned in open-air pits. This meant that there was practically no limit to the number of corpses that could be burned at Auschwitz. Of the at least 1.3 million people deported there, it was the final destination for at least 1.1 million of them. Shortly after the war, the inscription on the memorial plaque at the far west of the Birkenau death camp read that 4 million people were killed at Auschwitz. This was changed in the 90s to read that around 1.5 million people were killed. So how come the overall Holocaust death toll of 6 million wasn't revised downwards by 2.5 million as well? The answer is simple. When Auschwitz was liberated, it fell into the hands of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union calculated the death toll, well, it wasn't actually the dead that they counted. The 4 million figure was based on the capacity of the crematoria and how many people could have been theoretically burned in them during the camp's existence. It didn't take into account how many people were actually sent to Auschwitz and how many survived. The Soviet Union also tried to present Auschwitz as a general symbol of fascism to which communism was the antidote. In particular, it overlooked the racial element of the site and the fact that 90% of those sent to Auschwitz were Jews. Once the Iron Curtain fell, the political climate allowed for new research to take precedence in the East and for an updated memorial that reflected the death toll more accurately. Western historians knew immediately after the war that the death toll could never have been as high as 4 million. So too did SS Obersturmbannführer or Lieutenant Colonel Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, who initially gave a death toll figure of 2.5 million while in British military custody. However, Höss was repeatedly beaten at the hands of the British, and he likely gave this figure under duress. After testifying at the Nuremberg trials as a witness, Höss was transferred to Poland for trial in Krakow, and while in Polish custody, he was able to write his memoirs freely and explain the torture and beatings he faced while being held by the British. Crucially, he was also able to document what he believed to be the real Auschwitz death toll. Höss wrote, "I regard the number of 2.5 million as far too high. Even Auschwitz had limits to its destructive capabilities." Citing figures from memory given to him by Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, the head of Jewish affairs at the Reichssicherheitshauptamt or Reich Main Security Office and the SS officer responsible for coordinating the deportations of Jews to the ghettos and death camps, Höss reported a death toll of at least 1.13 million, which is much more in line with the death toll calculated by Western historians. While it was always the Nazis themselves who committed the actual act of murder and poured the gas into the gas chambers at Auschwitz, the nightmarish task of cleaning out the gas chambers, removing hair and valuables from the victims, and loading their corpses into the crematoria furnaces was always carried out by Jewish prisoners. These slave labourers were euphemistically known as the Sonderkommando or Special Squad. Knowing the historical significance of what they were witnessing and knowing that their chances of survival were very slim, several of them wrote secret diaries and journals which they then put in containers and buried in the grounds around the crematoria. These writings were then dug up after the war. While working on the grounds of Crematorium 3 in 1980, a Polish forestry student unearthed a leather pouch with a thermos flask inside. And inside that thermos flask were the writings of Marcel Najari, a Greek Jew and Sonderkommando member. Underneath the garden there are two endless basement rooms. One is meant for undressing, the other is a death chamber, Najari wrote. People enter naked, and when it's filled with about 3,000 people, it's closed and they are gassed. What's particularly extraordinary about Najari's writings is that he actually estimates the Auschwitz death toll, giving a figure of 1.4 million. This is remarkably close to the calculations given by historians today, and shows that the amounts of trains and Jews arriving at Birkenau were clearly topics of discussion among Sonderkommando prisoners. So, after adding together the 2 million killed in mass shootings, the 1.1 million killed at Auschwitz, and the 1.7 million killed in the other death camps, we reach a subtotal so far of around 4.8 million Jewish deaths. In addition to the death camps, there were hundreds of concentration camps at which Jews and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi state were imprisoned and murdered via beatings, torture, medical experimentation, starvation, disease and exhaustion. In fact, across occupied Europe, the Nazis established more than 40,000 sites of incarceration, ranging from well-known concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau to ghettos in major European cities like Krakow, Warsaw, Lodz and Riga. For example, in the Warsaw ghetto in Poland, up to 460,000 people were confined to an area of just 1.3 square miles, averaging out at 9 people for every room in the area. While most Jews in the Warsaw ghetto were deported to Treblinka and murdered there, at least 92,000 died within the ghetto from starvation and disease. In total, between 800,000 and 1 million Jews died in ghettos, labour camps and concentration camps. If we use the midpoint of this figure, 900,000, then we reach a subtotal of 5.7 million Jewish deaths so far. Of course, the Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers and death camps. Nazi persecution of Jews started long before the Second World War and long before the Nazis came to power. At least 250,000 Jews were murdered in acts of violence outside of ghettos, camps and mass shootings, such as in pogroms, in individual executions, and while in transit in Nazi custody, such as in forced marches. A very well-known example of this is the Auschwitz death marches, in which the SS evacuated the camp from the approaching Red Army and forced 56,000 prisoners to march west in the bitterly cold Polish winter. Approximately 15,000 prisoners died along the way. Adding 250,000 to our previous figure of 5.7 million, we now reach a total of 5.95 million Jews, which of course is typically given as 6 million. Since there isn't one individual piece of documentary evidence that can account for the entire Holocaust death toll by itself, Holocaust historians are left with no choice but to combine demographic information with their very best calculations of the death tolls from individual sites and operations to reach a final overall death toll. While 6 million is the most widely accepted whole figure, historians have also given figures ranging from 5.4 million to 6.2 million. These figures are still, of course, entirely within the order of magnitude of 6 million, and significantly lower figures like 2 or 3 million are very easily proven to be wrong.